Well, we've got the four of us together. Let's talk about this Bengals free agency strategy, free agent class, and what we would do.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, joined today by your host, James Rapien, friends of the show, Joe Goodberry at Joe Goodberry on Twitter, and Mike Santagata at Bengals_Sands on Twitter. We're going to get into free agency today and the strengths, weaknesses of the class. It's going to be a two-part episode. We're going to reveal the tier list that is in progress for free agents. That's probably coming in part two, so make sure you come back for that episode. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals, bringing you coverage of your team every day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube. So hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow anywhere you get your podcast so you can be easy access into the First Listen Club because you'll get those notifications when we upload our content every day. And guys, free agent class is different this year than last year. The Bengals in a very different place than they were last year. We're going to start by talking about, in general, how this year might be different. And we've heard from Bengals personnel staff talking about how this year could be different. They're going to be apparently trying to keep their own. They're dealing with Joe Burrow extensions, T. Higgins extensions, big cash outlays for those two players. And the expectations are kind of that when we're looking at external free agents, maybe don't shoot quite so high. That's what we've talked about so far. But any team that's gone to the Super Bowl lately has had free agent additions that have been part of that run, as we've often observed. So, all those things in mind, what are initial thoughts? Let's start there. And James, we'll keep it with the original hosts here for a second. What are the initial thoughts about, the Bengals' approach to free agency?
I still hope they're aggressive, and that's my expectation. Now, that might not mean two signings or two agreed to terms with two guys within like 20 minutes like it was last year. I mean, how crazy was that with Alex Kappa and Ted Karras? I think it was a couple of hours, but it might not be that. But is it fair to expect a starting level offensive tackle in free agency? I think that's fair. Is it fair to expect them to retain a couple of their current free agents that are probably going to hit the market and be available to sign with any team? I think that's fair as well, along with, of course, an extension for Joe Burrow, and then we'll see on T. Higgins. That's my expectation. What about you guys? Let's start with Joe, I guess. We'll go in alphabetical order. Jay's in front of S. So, Joe, what are your expectations going into this free agency class for the Bengals?
It's kind of an expectation and a hope that they stay aggressive. I feel like all the top teams will continue to be aggressive. They have the last few years. Free agency has really come from up maybe even 5 years ago, where it was like, be wary of the top guys there. They're available for a reason to, hey, there's bargain guys out there, or there's going to be free agents out there that can help your Super Bowl caliber roster right now. And I've kind of grown fond of the tier 3 guys. The Bengals have lived there. I mean, other than DJ Reader, they've made a lot of these second wave acquisitions in free agency. Maybe they don't happen on the first hour like the Alex Kappa. He was a tier 3 guy, but they targeted him, got him, and got an upgrade, even if you sign him early. Point is there, the tier 3 guys, and we're going to talk about tiers as we get into that later episodes, I'm sure, Jake and James. But the idea there is, can the value meet the production and the upgrade and the opportunity? And I think the opportunity is definitely there. They might be value players as it is, and there's a few upgrade positions that they should be targeting and trying to help this team out. So yeah, I'm hopeful.
And that's a point that I think it was Sam Monson made, recent guest on Locked On Bengals, when we talked about the draft a little bit last week. The Bengals last year in particular didn't wait for wave 2 to sign the wave 2 guys. And that has served them pretty well. I mean, they've waited till wave 2, obviously, as well in recent years to get those wave 2 guys, but those guys have hit, and that's been a big reason that they've been good. I mean, Chidobe Awuzie technically is tier 2, wave 2 kind of guy. He had huge upside as a young athletic corner, but was coming off a down year in Dallas. Von Bell wasn't a huge market for him when he came to Cincinnati. Hayden Hurst, another example where his market didn't materialize, and he signs a 1-year prove-it deal with the Bengals. Mike, what would you like to add here as we head into this free agency period coming in a couple weeks?
Yeah, it feels like you really have to find the starters that are wide open. I think we all just kind of take for granted that Von Bell or some type of safety is going to sign there. But if you're going into the season or the draft with Tyson Anderson as your second safety, it's not great. You probably want to patch that hole with somebody in free agency, even if it's not even a tier 3 guy, if it's a tier 4 guy, just somebody that you feel confident going out there and taking snaps. But to go with that, I'm kind of with James a little bit, where I kind of want to see him push the next year or two, the window before the Burrow contract hits. And I know that's kind of tough with the cash that's getting allocated to Joe Burrow here, but man, I just can't stop thinking about adding like a Javon Hargrave type to the defense. And I know that's very unrealistic, but even like a David Onyemata, is that out of their price range because they're already paying all that to the defense? Just get an interior pass rusher, because that's really what was missing in that Super Bowl on defense, or in the Super Bowl, but in the championship game on defense was, to me, the interior pass rusher, because the second best pass rusher in that game was probably DJ Reader, and he's a nose tackle who probably shouldn't be taking those snaps.
Yeah, and we haven't hit on defensive line a ton because of the resources that they're putting towards that group and how much they are paying them. But I agree, and I think that's the part that's interesting, because if they go with this second wave strategy, Von Bell's the perfect example of this. When they signed him in 2020, he was not their number 1, number 2 target. He was someone where the dust settled, he didn't have a chair, and they were like, oh, well, come sit here in Cincinnati. And I wonder who that's going to be. Obviously, we continue to talk about offensive line, but is there a path where they find another interior pass rusher and someone that's going to make Lou Anarumo and Marion Hobby smile? Wouldn't shock me one bit.
I wonder who that would be.
Yeah.
In this free agent class. Like, there are some guys, and we'll get to this when we get to the tiers, where you look down at some of the wave 2 defensive linemen. There are some guys there that can help you, that you might be able to buy low on, where, maybe they're tier 3, tier 4 guys, but you can add depth there. And really where I would focus, if it were me, would probably be on the interior. And part of that is because, you've got Joseph Osai, you've got Jeff Gunter coming back, you've got Cam Sample, who showed something late in the year. So the edge depth, I feel, has stepped up a little bit. You would still like to add, if you could, a dynamic player there, but I feel like the route for that is more through the draft than free agency for this team in particular, that will like to draft for the future when they're in this position. But to Mike's point, you've got a couple starters out there right now that you need to make sure you've got something for. And I think that right tackle is one that we've talked about a lot. And you're right, Mike, there's just this assumption about safety, but they need to find a veteran, if it's Von Bell or someone else, most likely for that role. Although I will say this about the Bengals at safety too, is that they tend to surprise us with some of their personnel choices at safety. James, you have
Do you think he's the most likely, Joe, free agent to return? Von Bell?
Yes, I would say it's probably him, with the next guy maybe being Hayden Hurst. And just because if he doesn't get the contract out there, I think the matching and the pairing of the player and team there was a fine fit.
It's also apparently a good place for tight ends to be. CJ Uzomah, Hayden Hurst, the last couple of years, pretty solid production. Uzomah went on to get a good deal. Hurst in position to potentially get a good deal, although it is a fairly saturated tight end market this year, which I think hurts all those guys a little bit in free agency, and the draft is expected to be really strong at that position. Let's continue this conversation with a conversation about what we expect them to do. And then we'll get into some specifics, perhaps, about what they will do. We've talked a little bit about the overview, and maybe there's some conversation coming up about, the strengths and weaknesses of the free agency class and those sorts of things as well, because that kind of fits hand in hand. So we'll continue the conversation here coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by Built Bar, and headed to the NFL Combine this week. I'm sure some of our listeners are as well. If you need a snack in the middle of the day, in the middle of your travel, well, Built Bar is perfect for you. And if you're like Mike Santagata, who I know is pushing weight in the gym daily, well, you can also get the number one protein bar on the planet. And you should. Why? Well, because it's covered in 100% chocolate, tastes great, and high protein, low sugar, low calories. It's perfect for Bengal sands. It's perfect for in between meetings or if you're going to the combine. So make sure you check it out right now, built.com. You can also check them out at Walmart or your local Sam's Club. So it's easier than ever to get Built bars. I talk about them all the time. You know it, Built bars, the number one protein bar on the planet at built.com, Walmart, and Sam's Club.
Let's talk a little bit about this free agency class next, because I feel like understanding the class on the whole is important to understanding what the Bengals may or may not do, what we think they'll do, what we would do, and obviously those things will be different. But Joe, as you look at this free agent class, one of the observations I made pretty quick was it doesn't seem to be as top heavy as recent years. I feel like the number of tier one free agents really the last couple of years has been trending down. And this year, I think we have 3 pure tier ones. Last year it was maybe 5. The year before that, maybe it was 8. I don't recall 2021, but outside of that, what are your impressions about this free agency class, where the strengths and weaknesses are and how they line up with the Bengals?
Yeah, I think to your point there, teams are trying to keep their stars, and I think that aligns with how we look at the Bengals roster as well. Keep your stars, try and fill in what you can around there with value free agents. When I look at the class and the strength, and maybe that, you want to see a strong class, not only because it means more options for everyone, but also because it should hurt the value, hopefully, of those guys. No offense to them, get as much money as you can, but I'd like to save $1 million or $2 million on each one of these players and add a final piece at the end of free agency. But I think tight end is pretty strong. I think the offensive tackle class, while there's not a tier 1 guy, we don't even have a tier 2 guy, really, truly. I mean, Orlando Brown is maybe on a fringe of that, but it's a bunch of tier 3 guys that can come in and start for you. Alex Kappa level tackles, I keep referencing him because we were happy with Alex Kappa. You get a guy that's, in the second half of his 20s where the progression of an offensive lineman seems to hit their stride, and those second contracts can be really good at tackle and guard. And I think that's maybe a spot the Bengals want to dip into, or could, and have plenty of options. But I also think safety, and then a bunch of, you mentioned it, and I'm glad you did in the last segment, but there's a bunch of tier 3 and tier 4, maybe even tier 5 1-year guys on the defensive line at edge and interior, where I think you can fill it in. I think there's a lot of value free agents in this class, and it's easy to say now because we still have 2 weeks and guys are going to re-sign or get tagged, and more re-signing here to kill our value guys. But I do think if it continues the way it currently is, I do think there will be a lot of options.
And this is where they need to feast now. They're a destination for the first time in any of our lives, to be honest. And so they have to feast on that middle to end class. Everyone talks about how they have to draft well. Absolutely. But their free agent success put them in this position. And so hopefully they could continue to have that with some of these back end guys.
They also, Joe, just to point out, and we'll get here when we talk about some of the players, Jawan Taylor, Mike McGlinchey, solidly in that high tier 2, like not quite tier 2, but between 2 and 3, the way it shakes out for tackles, and some interesting names there. Mike, when you look at this class and thinking about the Bengals approach, what are some of the areas where you think you could see this team going and attacking in that wave 2 part of the free agent class in particular?
Yeah, I feel like the first one is, you guys keep mentioning offensive tackles, and I don't think they're up in that Jawan Taylor, Mike McGlinchey range, but no. I would be surprised if they don't find somebody who's at least like a swing tackle level, a tier 2, maybe the Jermaine Illuminors, but there's more than that. I know that becomes a hot name. He's got he looks good. He's got PFF scores. He's kind of the perfect guy, but there's other guys too. There's whoever out there, Billy Turner types that you feel okay if they're out there, if they have to be. I think it also might tell you what they might do in the draft, if they're going for somebody who's higher up on that versus if they're going for somebody that you're like, oh, is he going to start the whole year type? But what I'm sure they saw is that their depth eventually, and this would happen to most teams who lose 3 offensive linemen in a playoff run, their depth eventually got them. And that's what happened in the AFC Championship game, even though it looked good against the Bills. So I would be surprised if they don't grab somebody at offensive tackle. Interior, I don't know. I don't think they go for anybody, even though there's some fun names to think about being added here. But yeah, when I'm looking at the offensive line specifically, I think that they're going to add somebody that can play right tackle, just because you don't know about La'el Collins' future. And I know you can save money if you cut him eventually when he's healthy enough to be cut. So it looks like that might be something that they would do. I'd also be surprised if they don't grab at least starting caliber safety and a tight end as well. Just somebody that can take snaps, especially tight end, because even if you draft Michael Mayer at 28, tight ends take a minute to develop. It's not usually a plug and play position, even if he seems pro ready. So having somebody there that can take those snaps while he develops and you can get him some opportune looks would be ideal.
I think really the key is that the Bengals need to make sure that they play their playoff games on poor surfaces, snow or the Super Bowl surface, and then the offensive line is fine. Doesn't matter anymore, guys.
They also didn't play Chris Jones. That Bills defensive line was not the same caliber.
Yeah, there's a difference there.
No Von Miller is a big difference, right? As far as right tackle, I think what they do in free agency will tell us about La'el Collins. If they sign some swing guy that can play multiple spots but doesn't cost a lot, then La'el might be back next year and they might go that route. But if they go get, let's say, Illuminor, right? Let's say he gets a little more than projected and could, but the NFL might be lower on him than everybody else, like you said, Sands. So that part will be interesting to see. If they go that route and they spend a little bit more, then maybe that's it, for La'el in Cincinnati. I will say, of all the free agents, I would almost guarantee they sign a veteran tight end, whether it's Hurst or someone. I agree with you. I think they definitely do.
Let's talk about some of the Bengals' own guys real quick here. We talked a little bit about Von Bell, Hayden Hurst earlier.
Mm-hmm.
We spent some time, obviously, James and I, talking about some of these guys. Who do you want the Bengals to bring back? Like, as you look at the Bengals guys that are free agents, Jermaine Pratt is a bit of a difficult one. Assume Jesse Bates is gone. Obviously, I think that if we had a choice, we might try or have done things differently with Jesse Bates, right? But assuming he's gone, Joe, how is there a guy that is under the radar that you would like to see the Bengals bring back, or is it really, those top guys? And if it is, then where do you come down on the Jermaine Pratt idea?
Pratt's tough because it's a philosophical thing. Because I think it's hard to pay a linebacker too much, especially one that doesn't rush the passer. And it's a strong linebacker free agent class. We didn't mention that, but if they wanted to replace with a cheap Sione Taki type, you could do that and spend a few million. But is Pratt going to get 12? Is he going to get 10 million? Is that too much? I think it could be too much if you're going to pay Logan Wilson as well, or at least attempt to. I think it could be too much if that's not how you want to build your team, philosophically. When you approach your team, even I don't care if you're playing Madden or building a fantasy roster or whatever you're doing, you have to decide where you want to spend your resources and your most valuable resources. Do you want to do that at linebacker? When I think Akeem Davis-Gaither was a very good prospect and has done nothing to say he's not going to be a fine starting player in the NFL. I think as long as he can handle the increased role, I think he should be fine, and you shouldn't have much of a drop-off there as much as I like Jermaine Pratt. Now, is there an underrated guy? Yeah, maybe it's like a Trey Flowers. Maybe it's a Samaje Perine. But can you keep Perine and Mixon at a veteran salary? That's tough. That's hard for me to swallow philosophically as well. So I don't know if there is an underrated guy that I have to have. In fact, even with Hurst and Bell, I look at the free agent class, and if Juan Thornhill's there, I would be like, all right, I'll get younger, faster, and better in coverage. And I look at tight ends too, and I'd say if Hayden Hurst is going to get $8 million, I'd rather throw 3.5, again, same type of contract at Irv Smith, and then draft a guy. Because
Agreed.
I don't feel like it's if you overpay for average, because like we said, the value when the Bengals sign these guys is they got good value in terms of money. If you now overpay at those same spots or at those positions, including linebacker, what are you doing? You're taking parts of the pie away from the rest of this potentially offensive line, defensive line, corners, whatever you value. You're now sacrificing something.
Let's talk a little bit about Samaje Perine, because I apparently think more highly of him than the rest of you guys do, marginally speaking. And there's a little bit of a Joe Mixon conversation here too that we can have. And then let's talk about maybe what we expect the Bengals to do. I think we've talked about it a little bit, but let's get into some of those specifics to finish this part of the show coming up next.
All right, Jake, Samaje Perine. Let's dive into it. It's not much different in the tier list.
It's not much.
I checked to make sure. I was like, does he have Perine as a 3.5 or something?
I did say it was marginally different. So
4.5.
yeah, it's very marginal. But to me, Perine's familiarity with the offense.
He's a 5, right? We're in agreement here. He's
everybody else is
3 of us say 5.
Okay, just so the people here that aren't seeing the sheet.
Yeah, we'll look at the sheet. But you guys all think he's a 5, fungible resource, totally replaceable running back. To me, there aren't very many running backs that pass protect at the level he did. And he's not as dynamic as Giovanni Bernard, who was really good in pass protection in that same role for the Bengals and added a little bit more dynamism to your offense. But I really like Samaje Perine's role in the offense. This pass-heavy offense, this drop-back offense. He was generally very reliable when he had to go back there and block. He was generally very reliable when they needed him to run the ball, when they needed him to catch the ball. And I recognize that some of that stuff is replaceable, but to me, the thing that elevates him compared to some other running backs that will be like the $2 million a year type running backs is that he pass protected at a high level and was trustworthy in that role. So, Mike, I know that for you, sorry, Joe, you have a comment. Why don't you jump in here?
I just want to say, like, all right, where's your line then? Would you give him 3.5, 4, $4.5 million just for a 2-year deal, per year?
My line's probably around $3 million.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it's still not a 3 or whatever, right? Like you wouldn't want to spend that much money on him. 2.5, $3 million.
Jake Liscow signed Samaje Perine to a 3-year, $21 million deal.
No,
that's the standard issue deal.
For who?
Bobby Hart's and Preston Browns and John Miller's. Remember that? That was free agency if you're new here.
That is true. Mike, I know that you have a premium in terms of pass protection at the running back position. That's something that you're looking at. We've talked about running backs in the draft quite a bit, and we'll talk about them on this show in the future as well. But I was surprised, to be honest, that his pass protection didn't get that half-point bump from you. What's your thought there? Do you think that is replaceable?
That's tough. The thing about it is I would love, and maybe this is unrealistic, but I want my third down back, my good pass protector, to also be a good receiver. And
so who does that in the NFL right now?
I don't know. Like looking at cheap ones, like prime Latavius Murray could do that. Or
starting running backs do that.
Yeah, that's right. Some good starters. Jamal Williams does it. So there's a guy. But what I think of, I can't get out of my mind with the Perine thing is he's the pass catching back. And then the most famous play in my mind is against the Titans where he drops the ball and hits it upwards to the cornerback for a pick 6 to get him back in the game. Yep. That is just what goes into my mind with Perine as a third down back. I know he's done such a good job with everything, but I don't know. Can't get that out of my mind.
Screen for the touchdown versus
he ran the screen the wrong way.
Title game?
Hey, that was awesome. What a play to get the whole line to draw everybody the wrong way. God. And he goes that way. Now, I don't know if it's that replaceable, and maybe it's idealism to think that I could find somebody that could do his job and add more in the receiving game. Because I think there are a lot of people that look at backs that can pass protect like him as a hot commodity. Maybe the Bengals the past couple of years have just kind of, I'm taking it for granted. I think you can find that guy because I haven't had to deal with watching mostly bad pass protection. They get mixing off the field on those downs. So I don't know. You are kind of convincing to move it up half a tier to the 4.5, just a little bit, because I do think it's harder to find that I'm letting on. And the guys that typically do it well are not prime. If you're looking for cheap, it is like, why does Latavius Murray still have a contract? And it's like, because they trust him on third down. Why is Zeke on the field over Pollard all the time? Because they trust him on third down pass protection stuff. And neither of those guys at this point in their career are good receivers, or at least dynamic. So that does stick in my mind as something. But then I watched like Roschon Johnson out of Texas. And I'm like, this is just Perine that you can get in like the 5th round at 22 years old, because he already does a great job in pass protection. He can lead block and all that other stuff. But
he's more explosive.
He is. He's more explosive too. That's what it's like. If Roschon Johnson's like a 4th round draft grade, then why is Perine like why would we bring him back at a premium if we have
Because
something similar?
what did we just talk about with Joe Mixon before we started recording and his pass protection in college versus the NFL?
It's true. Mike wasn't here for that, was he?
Oh, okay. Joe, what did we talk about? Fill the people in.
Yeah, I went back and looked at Mixon because he was a great running back prospect. Yeah, he was there in round 2 for obvious reasons, if you remember. But his pass protection was good at Oklahoma. He was a great receiver at Oklahoma. In fact, he was a good receiver this year. They still don't trust him as a pass protector, and that's the big issue. I think some of the ranking with P. Ryan, and as I'm listening to your arguments, and I'm agreeing, you're not wrong on any of those. It's just how we value it. I wonder if it's the conflict in me of you can't have both of those guys again.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just have Mixon and P. Ryan and roll that out there again at any price.
That's the part that makes it hard. And I think it almost feels like a package deal. I'm fine. Heck, put P. Ryan as the fourth tier if you want, and pay him $3 million for 2 years or 3 years if you have a rookie contract for your other running back, not we have a superstar in Joe Mixon who doesn't play like a star anymore. And he just does. I know he had the 5 touchdown game, but he's just not that, because if he was, you guys watch, star running backs are on the field on third down and making those explosive plays and are able to pass protect and doing all those things, which we could easily turn this into a star running back argument. And that's what this Bengals team could use, but it's not Mixon. And so I'm fine with bringing back steady P. Ryan, but not if you're paying him and paying Joe, because you're probably at 16 million, 17 million per year for those two guys. And that should be one of the best running back tandems in the league, and it won't be.
So let's starting right tackle.
Yeah.
And it's paying P. Ryan to not be the starter, probably. Like, he's probably not going to be the starter on first and second down. So you're giving him $3-4 million, and he's just your third down pass protection guy, really.
It'd be curious to see what the contract would actually be for P. Ryan if it is $2.5 million a year versus $4 million a year. Like, that's a big difference at the running back position in particular. It's not a big difference in the grand scheme of the salary cap, which is like $250 million. But for the Bengals, for the running back position, when, as Joe says, if they were to free up $10 million from the running back position, that is a right tackle. Let's talk about what will they do? Let's get some predictions here for the treatment of Joe Mixon and La'el Collins. Collins, a bit of a mystery, I think, to all of us, requires some speculation because you don't know how his rehab is going. You don't know what the prognosis is on the knee. We have heard nothing about that. Maybe a question for Duke Tobin at the Combine in a couple of days here.
Noted.
We'll see if we can get that question in there about how he's doing and what the expectations are for his recovery. But what do you think? Joe, let's start with you. I think we went to Mike recently. How are they going to handle this? Aaron Jones, is that a blueprint for Joe Mixon? There's some differences because they restructured into void years there in Green Bay, which is a little shocking in and of itself. But Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, and I kind of want to wait to see what happens with Zeke Elliott as well, because they could franchise Tony Pollard. And honestly, right now, it's kind of flipped where the value of a franchise tag on running back, 10-point-something million for Pollard. Okay, you'll do that for 1 year. But what do you do with Zeke? Kind of a situation to watch as they try to figure it out. Do they just outright cut him or restructure into a manageable deal? And that's the thing. I think people will say, well, we could just restructure this guy, that guy. You know, only some guys are available to either restructure, kind of almost rewrite their contract. Mixon is a guy that you could say, I mean, when you guys had Andre Perota on, he had a great suggestion, and make it incentive-based. Mixon, bet on yourself here. You're still 1,200 yard, 10 touchdown back here. You'll make your extra money, and it just won't count against the cap. That's genius. That should be done.
It would next year because
yes,
of the
it would, because likely to be earned. Yes, but that's how you do it. And if that can save them a little bit of money and keep him here, and they still feel good about Mixon because he is still good, I'm just not sure he's the best option for this offense, right? I'm just not sure he's exactly what they need to take this offense to the next level. If it was still a run-heavy offense, I'd be fine with Joe Mixon. I actually like Joe Mixon still for the next 2 years at the value he's at. That's okay. I wouldn't be banging the table to get rid of him or even scouting running backs as much as I am. But I do think something has to be done. You can't just let it go the way it currently is and just roll back out there, even with a drafted guy, and say, we're fine paying Mixon $12 million this season. And then for La'el Collins, I don't think they have to make a decision now. I think you can go into free agency. If you say, hey, we want durability and youth for the first time at right tackle because we tried Riley Reeve, he's gotten hurt. We tried La'el Collins, he's gotten hurt. Here's Jawan Taylor, a guy who's played 99.9% of the snaps over the 4 years. We don't care that he might be a little overrated, or in terms of, that's tier 3 guys getting paid heavy in free agency. Fine, it is what it is. We're going to pay it, and we're going to plug him in at right tackle. We're not going to worry about right tackle anymore at all. If he gets hurt, it'll be, unpredictable at this point because he's been so durable. Things happen. But point is, then you cut La'el Collins. Then you do something with La'el Collins. If you don't find that guy in free agency and you got to go into the draft, fine. Maybe there's a guy in the first round that you think starts right away. Then you figure it out with Collins. If not, even if you're in round 2 or round 3 now with a tackle, well, then you may want to keep Collins and see what happens in camp. Maybe it's Pupla's situation first 6 weeks. We don't know yet. But point is, it gives you another option and raises the depth level of the offensive line.
I think there's a good question there about the mix and scheme fit. It's something that I mentioned to Mike that I want to talk about at some point with Joe Mixon and the running back position. What would the ideal running back look like for this team if it's not, the superstar? But like, what are the ingredients? Bijan Robinson is an ideal running back for a lot of teams, for example.
Yeah.
But when you talk about the things that the Bengals need, if it's not the perfect running back prospect, what does that look like? Something that we can talk about at some point in the future. But that's going to conclude part 1 here of our free agency roundtable. We're going to get into the tier list a little bit in our next episode, talk a little bit about what we would do if we were the Cincinnati Bengals in the next episode. And in addition to, I'm sure, some tangents about players like Samaje Perine or Von Bell or Jermaine Pratt, because that seems to happen organically. So we'll continue this in part 2 coming your way tomorrow here. And until then, we appreciate you listening to the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.